Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us and participating in this Church and Society webinar. This is the second webinar in our Plowshare Vision, Peace to be Learned and Practiced, called Webinar Series. Today's webinar, Local Peace and Global Conflict, we will focus on the global dimensions of international peace building and the many layers of global governance that lead to peace. My name is Reverend Katie Monforte, and I'm the Education Program Coordinator here at Church and Society. I'm glad to be moderating this webinar with my colleague, Amy Hong. For accessibility purposes, I wanted to begin by sharing a physical description of myself. I'm a Mexican-American woman. I have brown hair and brown eyes. I'm wearing a pink top and a navy blazer. I'm sitting in my office and there's a shelf in the background. As we begin, we'll take a brief look at the webinar schedule. We'll be offered a lecture today by Dr. Susanna P. Campbell. She will share with us, and during her sharing, I'll ask that you populate questions through the Q&A feature. We want you to build on this conversation through your engagement. So put your questions in there and Amy will offer those to Susanna as we have that Q&A portion. Then we'll close with announcements. It is my privilege to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Campbell. She is the Associate Professor of the School of International Service and Director of the Research on Implementation of Policy Lab at American University. Her research examines the interactions between international and domestic actors in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, addressing state building, peace building, peacekeeping, international aid, and global governance. She uses a mixed method research approach and has conducted extensive field work in conflict-affected countries, including Burundi, the Dominican Republic of the Congo, Nepal, Sudan, South Sudan, and East Timor. Her research has been supported by so many awards, so I'm just going to highlight a few. The National U.S. Science Foundation, Humanity United, the Swiss National Foundation, the Swiss Network for International Studies, the United States Institute of Peace, the Swiss and Dutch governments, and the United Nations. She received the SIS Scholar Teacher of the Year Award in 2018. You can check out Professor Campbell's first book, Global Governance and Local Peace. You can also soon find her second co-authored book, Aid in Conflict. She has been published in many scholarly journals. Prior to graduate school, she worked with the United Nations International Crisis Group and was on the Council for Foreign Relations. She received her PhD from Tufts University and was a postdoctoral researcher at Columbia's Saltman Institution of War and Peace Studies and the Graduate Institute in Geneva. In her PhD research, she was supported by USIP as a Peace Scholar Fellow and the Tufts Provost Fellowship. Her scholarship has had a profound impact on policies of the United Nations, international government organizations, private foundations, and governments. In 2018 to 2019, she also served as a senior advisor to the Congressional Task Force on Extremism in Fragile States. With those renowned qualifications, it's a joy and an honor to hand it over to Dr. Campbell as she shares her expertise and research with us. Thank you for being here today, Dr. Campbell.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Reverend Montfort. So to give you a description, I guess look like an Irish American. I have curly hair that has a lot more gray than you saw in that picture, which I now realize. And it's dark curly hair though, and I am wearing a white shirt and a white and black checked vest. And I really want to start, I have some slides to share, and I'll just go ahead and share those, but I want to kind of start giving you a little bit more of a background about how I came to this place, which I think is important to really understand. Hang on, let me get Zoom working here. 1 second. Okay, share. Okay, let's do slideshow. 1 second here. Okay, do we have that? Do we have the right screen here? Are you seeing we're good? Okay. Okay, so you're not seeing my presenter screen, you're seeing the main screen I have. Basically,
actually, Dr.
you're seeing the
Campbell,
presenter screen.
Yes, we are.
Okay, so 1 second here. I think let's try this. How's that? Better?
Yes, much better.
Great.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, great. Sorry, thank you. So my dad is an Episcopal minister, and I think I want to give a bit of a background there because I think that's an important place that I come from when looking at this work and when doing this research. So I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and my family was very focused on working through the church for social justice. And I grew up in the 70s in Richmond, and that was a time when 70s and 80s, when there was a lot of change and a lot of really trying to work on school integration and true racial reconciliation in the capital of the Confederacy. And so I started focusing when I was an undergrad in the 90s on issues of ethnic and racial conflict because it was what was very close to me as a child, kind of experiencing the complexity, experiencing social inequality, and the kind of sense of being both empowered and disempowered to change it. And so when as I found my pathway here, a lot of it came from really embracing the complexity of this and yet also having hope that you could do something about it. So that's part of how I look at this. And I kind of in some ways credit this background with me being very comfortable with being very critical of international peace building work at the same time as I'm very comfortable with praising that which seems to really work well. So that's part of what you'll see today is kind of how I'm balancing that. But I think my own personal story, particularly for this audience, helps you to see where I come from. So what I am talking about today is basically, I'll give the basic argument in my first book, but I want to give you some background on what we're talking about here. So the talk is called Global Conflict and Local Peace. I'm an associate professor at the School of International Service at American University and the director of RIPIL, the Research on International Policy Implementation Lab. And if I can get my computer to work properly, great. So as we look at this, you see that there is a lot of conflict around the world. And what we know, so the red is the very violent places and the orange to yellow are the less violent. And what we know is that conflict has varying degrees, and in most maps, actually, the US has a lot more conflict. This one doesn't, but it's also very much kind of at a national level and at a subnational level. There's a lot of variation. And that's really important to understand because when you're trying to resolve it, it means that there is in no way a one size fits all solution, not for any single country, right? And often not for any particular location. So this is where the kind of broader idea of local, quote unquote, local peace comes from. And for me, what's really important here is not to think of local in terms of occurring only at the community level, but local is being localized. That if we are going to actually help communities to reconcile, help people to stop fighting, that we're going to have to deal with people where they are, where they sit, and where they stand, and meet them at that place. And that means focusing on relationships, but it also means taking these kind of heavy bureaucratic global institutions that I talk about and trying to make them nimble and responsive to something that they really weren't designed to respond to. So that's kind of part of the theme here. How do we do this in a way that actually achieves some success? And in some ways, how likely is that success to be? So what I want to start off is some kind of just basic structure here of what we're talking about, is that when the traditional way of thinking about intervention in civil war or violent conflict, and right now that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about here is civil war. I think that's an easy image to hold in our heads, even though there's a lot of variation in what that actually looks like, is that you have this kind of prevention phase. If you get in before the war has gone, become extremely violent, right? So we see this axis is from kind of peace to war. If we get in before it's really violent, then we can focus on prevention. Then we're really doing kind of diplomatic activity where we're trying to help warring parties come to some kind of clear political agreement through some dialogue or mediation effort. That is usually called kind of conflict prevention, mediation, or into kind of peacemaking. Peacemaking tends to refer to the kind of peace agreement negotiation process that happens once the crisis has escalated. So once you have a lot of violence, right? So here's the violence threshold here. Once you have a lot of violence, then maybe the United Nations or high-level diplomats come in and support some type of broader peace process. And then the idea is that, okay, you have a peace agreement, and then you have, peacekeeping troops that come in to kind of keep that agreement. And then you have post-conflict peace building that happens after that, right? So the idea is you have an agreement, peacekeepers come in to actually enable the warring parties to disarm, and then you have peace builders who come in and do really the kind of socioeconomic development work and truth and justice work and reconciliation work to help to address the manifestation of the conflict and help to build institutions that can sustain peace. This diagram is often criticized because it assumes that, a country's war follows a very linear process here, right? Where clearly one step comes after the next, which it doesn't. But I want to kind of put it up there because this framework is generally how people still think about it. And this is a bit fuzzy, but this is from the UN Capstone Doctrine, which was trying to actually guide how the UN does peacekeeping and peace operations. And what they were trying to say is, okay, when we're responding, to that kind of conflict pathway, we can, if we're before conflict, we're doing conflict prevention. If we're during conflict, we're doing peacemaking. So like political negotiations and a peace process, or we're doing peace enforcement, which means that peacekeeping troops are going in there and actually kind of fighting part of the war to try to get armed groups who don't want to negotiate to get them to the negotiating table. And then after that, peacekeeping and peace building. And so at the center of this is this kind of political process. And so the main solution that the international community has offered is that as long as we can get the warring parties to come together and have a political agreement, right, then they can actually, that can form the basis within a democratic society, that can form the basis for actually moving forward and establishing broader socioeconomic, judicial, governance institutions and security institutions that can sustain peace. So this is what's important to remember, is that this is a really huge endeavor, and that it's trying to be comprehensive, both in the way that the international community, can you all see this on my screen? Sorry, the chat box, no? Okay. The way that the international community engages in conflict prevention and peace building, as well as the kind of multiple ways in which the domestic actors are supposed to engage. And so what we see right here is the kind of broader breakdown. If we go into kind of what is peace building, we see that there is a broader breakdown here, that peace building is, one second, we have a little bit of a technical issue here. All right, there we go. Okay. That piece, this is called the Utstein palette, that peace building, when you're trying to actually rebuild a society, that it has kind of 3 or 4 different dimensions that you're trying to support. At the top, you see kind of security. You're trying to support disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of ex-combatants. You're trying to reform the security institutions so that they are accountable to the political actors and not just to, a military boss. And you're trying to kind of generally take weapons out of the population. You're also trying to support a broader inclusive political process through good governance, through institution building, through human rights, through democratization. You're trying to support reconciliation and justice via dialogue with leaders from antagonistic groups, grassroots dialogue, other bridge building activities, truth and reconciliation. And you're trying to establish the socioeconomic foundations of what a country is supposed to need to sustain peace. This kind of physical reconstruction of economic infrastructure, repatriation, and return of refugees and IDPs. And the reason why I'm showing you this is not to overwhelm you, but it is to show that the scope and the scale of what peace building is supposed to do, which was only one piece. Remember, we're not talking about peacekeeping here. We're not necessarily talking about peace process mediation here, that it's one piece of this kind of massive international effort to support countries facing civil war. And yet it is comprehensive, right? This is all aspects of what we think of the governance by a state. And so the international community is coming in and trying to actually do this and support this in a conflict affected country. It is a massive, massive task. And this aligns with the kind of broader sustainable development goals, which are the goals that have been adopted by pretty much all of the states in the world to pursue via development aid or humanitarian or peace building aid, to pursue these kind of broad goals in every country. And so you see this real cooperation happening between states to say, you know what, we are committed to working together to achieving not only number 1, reducing poverty so that there is no poverty, but also 16, so that these countries, all the countries in the world, have peace, justice, and strong institutions so they don't have to face violent conflict. So yet again, another global commitment that is really comprehensive and which puts a kind of huge burden on the international institutions that are trying to do this to say that they're achieving these kind of maximalist aims. So that's the broader context that I investigate in my 2018 book called Global Governance and Local Peace, where I really look at under what conditions do we see international peace building actors actually contributing to peace, and what is peace? How do we know it when we see it, and what does this look like? And what I really focus in on here is the role of accountability to the population and accountability to headquarters in determining whether peace is built or not. So the basic argument is that international actors, all of these actors that I'm going to speak about, are in fact designed to fail at this local level peace building because they're accountable to global, not local actors. People in the UN in the United Nations are accountable to the Security Council or their governing board in New York, not to the population in Burundi. International peace building aims to change the behaviors of local actors, not global actors. International peace building is not trying to change the behavior of the Security Council in New York. It's trying to actually change the behavior of actors on the ground in these contexts. But to change the behavior of local actors, international actors have to be accountable to local actors. They need to get feedback from them. They need to know whether it's working. And so this is the basic problem that they face, to be accountable. And what I argue is that therefore, to be accountable to local actors when they're actually not, the staff of these different country offices often have to bypass or circumvent standard operating procedures that were established to hold them accountable only to their bosses at headquarters. So seemingly bad behavior, meaning they're not doing exactly what their bosses want, by country office staff may be necessary for global peacebuilding performance. So just to kind of put it up here, a basic example of what I'm talking about is that, you know, in this particular case of the UN peacebuilding in Burundi, what we see is kind of two examples of a project, right? So this was the kind of same overall project, but two outcomes here. We see on the left-hand side that this was a disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration project for ex-combatants. And one of them says, first, as a result of the UN peacebuilding project, first I changed, when we stopped fighting, we made people afraid. We had red eyes. I smoked marijuana and tobacco. I made myself afraid. I hated everyone. Clearly, they all hated me. Now, as you see me, I have changed. I love people and they love me. A very kind of clear, positive feeling from this former combatant, but something that really speaks to the effect from his perspective of the program. But the same program, when rebuilding houses, we see here a house that was built for what's called an IDP, an internally displaced person that was supposed to be returning to their home. There's no mortar between the bricks, there's no window, and there's no door. So, and what this person said is, this was poorly done. We have a problem of oversight. We spoke to the communal administrator often. He says that when we have to submit our questions to the governor, the response they give us is that the governor will submit the request to UNDP, UN Development Program, who is helping to implement it. And we see here that this person who is supposed to be receiving this peacebuilding good feels clearly disempowered, clearly frustrated, and there's no accountability. There's nobody he can go to. So what I try to understand is, how do we explain this difference? This is the same overall project, the same organization, the same time frame, the same donor, the same country, but different results. One worked, one didn't. Why? So the question that I ask and try to answer in this book is, what explains the variation in local peacebuilding performance of global governance organizations? And what we see in general is that the literature on this, the scholarship on this, argues that, you know, peacebuilding is successful when you have money, troops, and opportunities. So when you have essentially enough resources, that it fails because essentially these international actors do not understand the local context in which they intervene. And what I say is, okay, that's fine, but you're actually ignoring the behavior of all the different international organizations operating in this space. And when you begin to look at that, you get at how these individual, whether international, non-governmental organizations, the United Nations, or individual donors, how they actually behave. And that's really what I focus on in this book, right? So I focus on this set of actors over here, whether it's UNICEF or the UN Peacekeeping or Search for Common Ground, which is a peacebuilding NGO based in DC, or UN Development Program, or US Agency for International Development, or the World Bank, or CARE International, or DFID, the development agency out of the UK. I look at how are they actually behaving, because peacebuilding in effect is made up of multiple activities in multiple actors. So if we're really going to understand success and failure, we need to understand how they are behaving, and when they're actually when each organization, each country office is likely to relate to be able to learn from and be accountable to the local stakeholders that it aims to serve, and when it isn't. So peacebuilding, what's really important in kind of understanding what peacebuilding is trying to do is that it aims to create change in a changing context, right? And it aims to do that in a way that this change is implemented and sustained by local actors. It's not like, you know, the United Nations is deploying a kind of peacebuilding effort and it's trying to stay there forever and do the peacebuilding itself. No, it's actually trying to build the capacity of the state and society that has been affected by conflict to sustain peace. But the effect of trying to change a changing context coming from the outside and do it in a way that is actually sustained by actors in that context is extremely difficult, right? So not only are we dealing with the scope, the kind of breadth of activities are challenging, but the actual nature of peace building itself is really challenging. But to change changing context, organizations must learn. Organizational theory says that for organizations to change a changing context, they actually have to understand that context. So they have to keep up with the changes and understand how these changes in the context actually affect what they're supposed to be doing. There are kind of two different definitions of organizational learning, which is really important. And I'm gonna focus on the latter, but I think that this is important when any of us think about this kind of concept. That one, we can think learning is just kind of intaking information or knowledge. That is not what I'm talking about. We can all kind of read a book or intake information, but if we don't act on it, then we actually haven't done anything with it. So the definition of learning that I'm talking about is action to identify the gap between aims and outcomes, right? So are you actually identifying the gap between what you're doing and what you want to do? And then are you acting on that information? And that's extremely important because that means that learning doesn't happen just because you understand the local context. Learning happens only when you take that information about the local context and you actually use it to change what you're doing. So organizational learning requires regular feedback about both the success and the failure of an organization's peace building activities. And not only that, it requires that the decision makers, so the people within the organization, so within, let's say, CARE International, intake that information and deal with it in a non-defensive way, which is a high task for anyone, right? Which one of us is actually easily able to take information about our successes and failures and deal with it in a non-defensive way. But one of the only ways for an organization to learn is for it actually to have both information about success and failure and to deal with it in a way that is really open. But global governors, all these different organizations that I'm talking about, are in fact not accountable, as I said, to these local stakeholders that they aim to support. They're accountable to their global bosses, to the UN Security Council in New York, not to the population or the community members or the state or society in Burundi. That the direction of accountability determines feedback and action, right? So if I am, when I tell my students in class to give peer review and peer feedback, it's often not great unless I say you have to give it exactly in line with this rubric because I am holding you accountable for the way that you give feedback to your peers, right? So we gear our energy, we gear our activity, we gear our targets toward those who are actually charged with judging you, right? So the direction of that accountability determines what you do. It determines what your targets are, it determines what kind of feedback you give, and it determines what kind of actions you give. So feedback about success and failure in the international peace building world is reported by the producer, not the consumer, meaning that the NGO, so CARE International, when it's actually giving feedback about what works and doesn't, it assesses its own performance. It says what it is doing that's good or not. The community members have no capacity in this international aid setup to say what is CARE doing, what it should be doing or not. That kind of feedback loop is completely blocked. So for like a country office like CARE International, accountability is the pursuit of global, not local targets. That's essential. So they're operating in this context and they're actually focused on achieving what their donors or what their headquarters tell them to do, not what the local communities tell them to do. But to succeed, they need to actually figure out and respond to what the communities want them to do. So local performance requires what I call informal local accountability. The country office gives a representative group of local stakeholders the authority to, one, determine their standards, determine what they should do, hold the country office responsible for achieving these standards, and apply some kind of informal sanction or incentive for doing when they don't do that. That's really difficult, but I've seen several different examples of where that happens, and it's extremely impressive. So it's possible to do. Local accountability is informal because local stakeholders can set standards and apply sanctions or incentives to enforce these standards, but the country office never has to respond to this local accountability. It chooses to do so. So in one example, the United Nations, when implementing a mediation effort, it said, you know what, we really need a local accountability mechanism. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a group of people, a group of politicians, and a group of civil society members who were participating in the effort, and we're going to actually make them the monitoring group. We're going to ask them to hold us accountable for whether this is working or not. They're going to monitor it. They're going to talk to other stakeholders. They're going to really be our eyes and ears, and we're going to give them the authority to do that. So the United Nations could have chosen not to actually listen to that. So they don't have to respond to that local accountability mechanism. But when they do, it changes everything. It builds trust, it builds relationships, it gives regular feedback, and it enables learning. And in so doing, it enables ownership, buy-in, and eventually success. So, but what I want to say is that this requires, to some degree, some rule breaking or rule bending by people in the country office, because creating these local accountability mechanisms requires much more effort. It requires doing what the population or other stakeholders want you to do rather than what headquarters wants you to do. And because headquarters is often really focused on timeframes and spending money by a budget and delivering what was in the logical framework or the plan, this can create a lot of tension. So informal local accountability requires that the country office prioritize actions that correspond directly with the preferences of local actors, not their global bosses. This requires often rule breaking or rule bending behavior where individual staff have to bypass or ignore standard operating procedures designed only for global accountability. But organizations only learn what they know. And what's really important here is that even when getting this feedback, organizations can only respond to feedback that actually aligns with what they know and understand. So I'm going to move a little bit quickly through this because I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. But basically, if I'm a peace building organization, I'm only going to listen to information about kind of the peace and security factors. If I'm a development organization, I'm only going to listen to information about like development outcomes. And what that means is that it's just as a doctor, when they look at a patient or look at someone, they do a medical diagnosis. A lawyer does a legal diagnosis. Organizations operate in the exact same way. And so what this means is even if an organization gets really good feedback from the population, right, they can only listen to that which actually aligns with their aims, because they can't kind of totally ignore headquarters either. They can't totally ignore their donors. They really have to find this balance between the two. So learning is bound by an organization's priority and targets. To learn in relation to peace building aims, the organization itself needs to prioritize peace building above other aims, such as development or humanitarian, or any of those kind of multiple aims that I showed in the kind of sustainable development goal list. So what I find and argue in this book is that there's a really kind of crucial mix that needs to come together for country offices, for peace building organizations actually to be successful. One, they have to have a focus of their headquarters and formal accountability on peace building. That has to be the main thing they're doing and their priority. And they have to have these informal local accountability mechanisms. And together, this enables them to get feedback about what's going on, process that information in an open and non-defensive way, and take action to reduce the gap between their peace building aims and their outcomes. And that enables organizational learning in relation to their peace building aims, which is likely to enable successful outcomes. But some rule bending and rule breaking behavior is often necessary to create informal local accountability. So this kind of solves the organizational performance problem that I talked about earlier. And what we end up with, which is really important, is that, if we look, this is a 2x2, what academics love to create, that we have many different types of organizations operating within this peace building space. We have some who end up being the peace building learner. They're accountable for peace building. That's really what they're trying to do. That's what they care about. And they have informal local accountability. They're likely to actually be the most successful. But we have others that are, say, maybe humanitarian organizations. They're not accountable for peace building. And even if they have all this feedback, they're still not going to do peace building. They're going to only do humanitarian activity. So it means that kind of doing multiple things at the same time is really difficult because we all have limited bandwidth and we can only focus on those things that are actually our priorities. There are two others here, sovereignty reinforcer and stagnant player. I'm not going to go into those right now because of time, but happy to talk about it in the Q&A. So in this upper left-hand quadrant, what we really see is that organizations that have informal local accountability here, that gives them information about the context and the people that they're trying to support. That is actually feeds into their formal accountability, where they listen to the information in there that is relevant to their peace building aims. That enables them to take action to reduce the gap between aims and outcomes. That's what's happening in the peace building learner. All of the others fall short in some way. These are the cases that I study. What we see is that organizations can move in and out, that an organization can be a peace building learner at one time and a micro adapter at another. And that's really interesting because it means that it's not like one organization is good or bad, right? Because the context is changing and the question is, are they changing or not? So in conclusion, global governance organizations can achieve positive peace building performance, but no organization is designed for it. That it really relies on them responding both to the kind of what their bosses say they have to do at headquarters and what the local communities say they have to do. And that some bad behavior is often necessary for good performances to really build these responsive mechanisms in relation to the local community. That what does this mean for policy? It means that you may not be able to actually, create logical frameworks or monitoring and evaluation mechanisms that really incentivize informal accountability. That because it is informal, once you make it a checkbox, then maybe you'll encourage it a little bit, but you won't ensure that it happens. It really is about individuals being willing to take these risks and being willing to engage. Their motivation really, really matters, because it's transaction intensive. And that also means that it's difficult to sustain. That for any organization to be kind of consistently successful at peace building is difficult because they have to invest in so many relationships. And in a changing context, that changes. It also means that an organization may not be able to do peace building and humanitarian and development at the same time. So what do we say? Is it about giving money to a country? Is it about trying everything? What the conclusion of this study really is that less may be more, maybe focusing on trying to do a few things well and allocating enough resources to support this real kind of accountability and feedback to the local population matters more than trying to spend a ton of money. So what I talk about here is that organizations also really need to focus on this idea of accompaniment focused rather than a client compliance focused accountability. That headquarters needs to say, you know what, I'm not going to try to hold you accountable for complying only. I am going to get in there and help you to problem solve and help to encourage you to develop these local accountability mechanisms. And by doing that, it's much more likely to happen. That staff need to be really enabled to take risks and engage locally, because this is quite hard work. It also means that we need to think about changing the staff time, increasing the staff time available to accompany each dollar spent. This is not about, decreasing staff time and trying to make sure every single dollar gets to the ground, because if you try to get every single dollar to the ground, unless you're doing kind of give directly or some, cash transfer, then you're not going to have the right people to actually create the mechanisms, the informal accountability to make sure it gets to the right place in the right time and is truly accountable to the population. It also means that if we want to increase peace building performance, we actually have to increase the broader funding for peace building to enable more actors to be accountable for peace building, not just development or humanitarian aims. Okay, I'll end there. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you, Professor Campbell, for your presentation, for taking such a massive task of and the thought of peace building and breaking it down for us. I felt like hearing about you speak on accompaniment was something that I think many of us that are perhaps watching right now can relate to, because it's the language that we talk a lot about in the faith community. And it's not a far off concept that we don't understand. So for accessibility, I'm a Korean American woman with dark hair pulled back, wearing a light gray shirt, sitting in front of a virtual background that is kind of green gray. So we had some questions that came in, and the first one that I would like to bring up, what are the major sources of conflict? And is there a decrease in major standard of living? What can be done before conflict begins?
So, I mean, what people argue is that the major sources of conflict are kind of the flip side of the solutions, right? So the major source of conflict is exclusion, right? So groups that are excluded from political representation. But if you have an authoritarian government and you have exclusion, then the government actually maintains stability and reduces conflict by I mean, there's plenty of conflict, by actually preventing even excluded people from having a voice. That's the authoritarian strategy. In a context that is kind of more democratic, or what's called an anacracy, which is that it's between authoritarian government and a democracy, then that's where it gets really tricky, because there's like this expectation of inclusion, but you're not really included. And then if you run out of ways to actually be included, then violence can be a solution, right, that you see. So that's the kind of simple breakdown. So this is why democracy, truly representative democracy, is viewed as a solution to conflict, because it gives everybody a way of exercising their voice, of participating in a way that they do not actually need to resort to violence. So poverty plays a role, but it's absolutely not the only thing.
I see. Thank you so much for that. Another question that came up, and this is more kind of specific to different countries, actually, but two of them that came up. One, it's regarding Yemen, and how the UN is working to bring about peace agreements in Yemen, but why is the UN not succeeding in that? And then the other question that came up that was specific to a country was regarding Haiti, and what your thoughts on why international intervention has failed there.
I love these questions. This is like, it's so complicated, but I mean, in some ways the answer is, it's so complicated and the answer is like super simple at the same time, right? Is that the problem is that this is an international community of states, right? So if we take, so I saw Ukraine, Yemen, and Haiti. One of the major problems with Haiti is that the US government and the UN has spent all this time propping up a state that is not accountable to its population. So if it's going in there and it's focused on kind of state building and not creating this local accountability that I'm talking about. So they're in my quadrant, they're like the sovereignty reinforcer. They're just reinforcing the state, but they're not enabling the state to be accountable to the population. Therefore, they're not enabling true inclusion. So they're not addressing the root cause. They're just kind of trying to put a Band-Aid over it by propping up the state. The only solution in Haiti is actually true socioeconomic development and political participation for the population. But the state itself and the government doesn't have an interest in doing that, right? And I mean, Yemen is super complex, and in part of Yemen is kind of the state of the state, right? That the state itself isn't very strong. And so, and you also have a proxy conflict with Saudi Arabia. And so what that means is that in trying to support a peace process, you're trying to bring all these different actors to the table and get them to agree to stop. But they don't necessarily have an incentive to stop, right? Because they may gain more from war and more power from war than they would from peace. Because in the end, when you have peace, somebody wins and you have to agree to that political agreement, right? And yet everybody participating in conflict wants to win. So they're all trying to get their seat at the table. And it's only when they feel happy that they've gotten their seat are they going to stop fighting. And often they never feel happy. So this is, I'm simplifying it, but that's the basic thing. Before conflict begins, you can try to do socioeconomic development, kind of really address exclusion. But the problem is that requires the state itself to do that. And if the state is part of, so the government, so let's say the Burundian government, if the Burundian government or the Haitian government is the country that's actually creating the exclusion, then what you have to do is ask them to change all of their policies. But often their political survival depends on them actually on the exclusion, right? So it's like what we deal with, you know, why don't we reform the US kind of electoral college or our system? In part, it's because the people who are elected who would have to reform it are actually empowered by that system, right? And so they don't have an incentive to change it. And that's the challenge.
It's also very depressing to think about it that way. Yeah. So it kind of ties to, I guess, one of the questions that just came in as well. Do you think that this model of can be applied in local areas, example, in the US?
Absolutely. And so this is, you know, when I talked about coming from Richmond, I mean, my entire family works on local quote unquote peace building in one way or another, you know, in the South, right? In Richmond and in different places. And the whole point is that it's not exactly the same problem, right? Because the US has these really, although somewhat problematic, really strong governance institutions, right? So, you know, how our government is set up is going to kind of prevent total breakdown. But dealing with local conflict, and particularly what I saw growing up, was in a lot of the really kind of impoverished areas in Richmond, that they were completely excluded from everything, from good education, from good jobs, and really kind of working with them was in fact peace building and giving them a voice and the opportunity to say what they needed and the opportunity to participate in the broader society, and trying to make the government and the educational institutions accountable to that population has been central to any reforms that I've seen that have actually worked in Richmond. So yes.
Thank you. And this will be, I guess, like the last question. For those of us watching that are not part of NGOs but dedicated local church folk and leaders within the church and in the denomination, what can we do to support peace building?
Right. So it's interesting. So I just wrote a piece about this in relation to Severine Audesser's book, where she talks about kind of how to be a peace builder. And what I wrote in my response to her book was very much that you just have to work where you are, right? You have to ask, where is your place of change? Where can you help to create better, more inclusion? Where can you help people to understand each other? What does that look like for you? And not to feel like, in the sense like, oh, I should travel overseas, or, oh, I should get a peace building degree. But the church is and can be, and I've seen myself many times, a crucial place for people to come together, right? Because they enter the room with a particular commitment to try to see the good side of others, to try to actually go the next step. So thinking about, you know, maybe taking the church out into communities where it isn't already, not in a proselytizing way, but actually in a kind of creating a space way. And so what is that next step that you can take, where instead of kind of being just within your own community, you can actually help to create a safe space and accompany others that are kind of left outside of that? And that's really the question. And I don't have the solution, but I'm sure everybody here has kind of an idea. And it has to be something that you feel comfortable with, but that also is going to kind of push everybody a little bit to the next step.
Wow, thank you for that rich conversation and being able to help us look at just local accountability and giving some of your personal background in giving that grounding and giving us a basis for that transformational work that we all want to be a part of.
You're welcome. And I mean, you know it, right? There were pieces of probably my talk that were more kind of, dealing with a world that you may not operate in, but there were pieces about like listening to people, understanding success and failure, really trying to hold yourself accountable that we all understand.
Yeah.
And it's as simple as that. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a ton of United Methodists who are doing that kind of accompaniment work. So being able to see what accountability looks like and different approaches to that is vital to the work that we do. So thank you so much for emphasizing that and encouraging us in the work as we continue.
You're so welcome. And thinking about how the broader accountability systems support or undermine that. And maybe those need to be shifted to better enable people to occupy that space that really matters. So I know that we need to end, so I'll stop responding. But yes, this has been a real treat, and I'm grateful for your time and for the invitation.
Thanks for the gift of imagining more possibilities and changing systems and structures. We're just going to move into some housekeeping closing announcements. So this webinar was recorded and you will be able to access it later. Be sure that you use this as a resource for your faith community to really consider how we further build an understanding of peace and how we use that peace building understanding to advance peace in our local communities in the midst of great conflict. Be sure to join us for our panel coming up to this afternoon, Means and Methods for Peace Building, and tomorrow's final panel, which has the UMC perspective, Peace Building in our United Methodist Church with our colleague, Holly. If you haven't registered for these events, you can still do that. And you saw the QR code on the last page. So take a picture of that and be sure to register. We also wanted to highlight that there are several opportunities for you to take action today. If you visit our website or take a picture of the QR codes on the page right now, you can see that there's opportunities that include supporting COVID international assistance, rejecting an increase to military spending, and funding for global climate finance, global health, and political stability. By choosing to act today, you join with others in giving a voice to policies that advocate and advance peace. You will be taking the education and knowledge that you gained today and putting it into action. So thank you for participating and being with us today. We hope that we continue to learn and practice peace. Amen.